What if America's greatest vulnerability isn't external threats or political division, but something far more fundamental? What if the United States is following the exact same pattern that ended British global dominance in 1956? Most people think the British Empire faded gradually over decades. They're missing the moment when everything changed. November 6, 1956, the day Britain discovered it could no longer afford to be a superpower. The day economic reality shattered imperial pretensions. Britain's final mistake wasn't losing its colonies. It was believing it could still act like an empire after it had already stopped being one. The mechanism that destroyed British power is operating again. The same trap, the same warning signs, the same pattern that turns apparent strength into sudden collapse. Let me show you how America is walking the exact same path. The year was 1945, and Britain stood victorious. London had survived the Blitz. British forces had fought on every continent. The Union Jack still flew over roughly a quarter of the Earth's land surface. By any measure, Britain was a global superpower. But here's what most people don't understand about Britain's position in 1945. The victory had been ruinously expensive. Britain's national debt had exploded from £7.1 billion in 1939 to £21 billion by 1945, a threefold increase in 6 years. That's 238% of GDP. Think about what this meant in practical terms. Britain had won the war by mortgaging its future. The country owed £3.4 billion to its own colonies, particularly India and Egypt. The creditor had become the debtor. On top of that, Britain owed the United States $4.33 billion through Lend-Lease, a debt that wouldn't be fully repaid until December 2006, 61 years later. Britain maintained 1.3 million troops stationed globally in 1946, from Germany to Malaya to the Middle East. Defense spending consumed 18.9% of GDP in 1947. To put that in perspective, that's higher than any major power spends today except in active wartime. Britain was spending like a superpower, while earning like a declining industrial economy. The trap was already closing. The hidden architecture of imperial decline follows a specific pattern. It's not about losing battles. It's about the mathematics of overextension creating a trap with no good exit. Here's how the mechanism works. You build global commitments over decades. Military bases, security guarantees, alliance obligations. Each seems rational when made, but collectively they create fixed costs that keep rising regardless of your ability to pay. Britain in 1947 faced commitments across 47 territories. Each required administration, security forces, infrastructure, and crisis response. When nationalist movements erupted in India, British forces intervened. When communists threatened Malaya, British forces deployed. When tensions rose in Palestine, British forces remained. The logic was simple. Each withdrawal would encourage the next. Each abandonment would signal weakness. So Britain held on. The cost of staying grew. The cost of leaving grew faster. That's the trap. When you're still strong enough to hold positions, but no longer strong enough to afford them, every option becomes bad. The second element is currency pressure. Britain's global commitments required maintaining the pound sterling's value. International trade was denominated in sterling. Confidence was everything. But confidence requires economic strength, and economic strength was evaporating. Britain's gold and dollar reserves stood at $2.7 billion in 1945. By 1947, they had fallen to $2 billion. By 1949, barely $1.3 billion remained. That's a 52% collapse in 4 years. The pound was overvalued. Everyone knew it. In 1949, the British government was forced to devalue from $4.03 to $2.80 per pound, a 30% overnight collapse. This wasn't new. In 1931, during the Great Depression, the same pattern had appeared. Britain abandoned the gold standard when reserves ran out. The difference was that in 1931, Britain still controlled enough global trade to recover. By 1949, that margin was gone. Each crisis weakened the foundation for handling the next one. The pattern was accelerating. And then came Suez. In July 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, seizing control from the Suez Canal Company, which was majority owned by Britain and France. The canal wasn't just a waterway. It was the artery of British imperial commerce. 2/3 of Europe's oil passed through Suez. For Britain, this was intolerable. Prime Minister Anthony Eden saw Nasser as another Hitler, an aggressor who had to be stopped before he grew stronger. The parallel to 1938 and appeasement was explicit in Eden's thinking. Britain couldn't let this stand. On October 29, 1956, Israel invaded Egypt's Sinai Peninsula. On October 30th, Britain and France issued an ultimatum demanding both sides withdraw from the Canal Zone. When Egypt refused, British and French forces attacked on October 31st. The operation was militarily successful. British paratroopers secured key positions. French forces advanced. Within days, the canal was effectively under Anglo-French control. But here's where the pattern revealed itself. The United States was furious. President Dwight Eisenhower had not been consulted. The invasion came 1 week before the U.S. presidential election. Eisenhower saw this as colonial adventurism, undermining American efforts to win Third World allegiance during the Cold War. The U.S. response was devastating. The Federal Reserve and U.S. Treasury began selling pounds sterling, driving the currency down. Britain's reserves, already depleted, hemorrhaged $45 million in the first week of November alone. American officials made clear there would be no IMF support, no financial assistance, no backing until Britain withdrew. Think about what this meant. Britain had the military power to hold Suez, but it didn't have the economic power to withstand American financial pressure. The empire had become dependent on its former colonies' approval. On November 6, 1956, facing economic collapse and American opposition, Britain agreed to a ceasefire. By December 22nd, British forces had completely withdrawn. The operation had lasted 53 days. The humiliation was total. The breaking point wasn't the military operation. It was the revelation of Britain's actual position in the global order. November 6th exposed what had been true for years but never tested so dramatically. Britain could no longer act independently as a great power. The economic foundation couldn't support the global commitments. Harold Macmillan, who would become Prime Minister in 1957, later wrote that Suez proved Britain had not adjusted our thoughts to our real position in the world. That's the understated British way of admitting total strategic failure. The consequences cascaded rapidly. In 1957, Britain published the Sandys Defense White Paper, announcing the end of national service and massive reductions in military forces. By 1960, British troop strength had fallen from 690,000 to 375,000. The permanent garrison in Germany was cut. Global deployments were slashed. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan launched his Wind of Change speech in 1960, acknowledging the inevitability of decolonization. Between 1960 and 1968, 31 British colonies gained independence. Ghana in 1957, Malaya in 1957, Nigeria in 1960, Kenya in 1963. The empire didn't gradually decline. It collapsed in 1 decade. The pattern is unmistakable. Suez didn't cause the decline. Suez revealed that the decline had already happened. Britain had been insolvent since 1945, operating on credit and prestige. The moment someone called the bluff, the entire structure fell apart. Think about what happened to Britain's global role. In 1945, Britain was one of 3 powers deciding the post-war world at Yalta. By 1962, Britain was begging to join the European Economic Community, which France vetoed. The superpower became a regional actor in 17 years. This wasn't failure. This was mathematics. The commitment structure exceeded the resource base. When tested, the gap became visible. Once visible, it became undeniable. Now let's connect all the pieces. Because the United States in 2025 is following the exact same pattern Britain followed from 1945 to 1956, the parallels are striking and specific. Start with global commitments. The United States maintains approximately 750 military installations in 80 countries. American forces are deployed in 150 nations. The U.S. has formal treaty obligations to defend 67 countries through NATO, bilateral agreements, and regional pacts. These aren't symbolic. These are operational commitments requiring forces, equipment, logistics, and constant expenditure. U.S. defense spending in 2024 reached $916 billion, roughly 3.4% of GDP. That's smaller than Britain's 1947 percentage, but the absolute numbers are staggering. Add in veterans benefits, intelligence agencies, homeland security, and related costs, and you're looking at well over $1.3 trillion annually dedicated to security infrastructure. Now look at the debt. U.S. national debt stands at $36 trillion as of early 2025, approximately 124% of GDP. In 2000, it was $5.6 trillion, or 55% of GDP. That's a 543% increase in 25 years. The cost of servicing this debt exceeded $880 billion in fiscal year 2024, more than the defense budget. Interest payments are now the fastest growing part of federal spending. Here's where the pattern gets exact. Just like Britain after 1945, America maintains global commitments built during an era of unchallenged economic dominance that no longer exists. The US became the global superpower when its economy was 50% of world GDP in 1945. Today, it's roughly 25%. China's economy is closing the gap, projected to surpass US GDP within the next decade. The relative economic foundation is eroding, while the commitment structure remains fixed. The currency dynamics are identical. The US dollar has been the world's reserve currency since the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944. Approximately 58% of global foreign exchange reserves are held in dollars. International oil trade is denominated in dollars. This privilege allows the US to borrow cheaply and run persistent deficits. But that privilege requires confidence, and confidence requires economic credibility. When that credibility weakens, the advantage can reverse suddenly. Think about what this means in practical terms. Every American commitment abroad assumes continued dollar dominance. Every security guarantee assumes economic capacity to sustain deployment. Every alliance assumes American willingness and ability to bear costs others won't. But the mathematics are becoming unsustainable. The US runs persistent trade deficits, averaging $773 billion in 2023. The current account deficit reached $194 billion in Q3 2024 alone. This is financed by foreign creditors, particularly China and Japan, who hold $1.9 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities combined. The debtor is defending the creditors. The pattern from 1947 Britain is exact. So where's America's Suez moment? What crisis will reveal that commitments exceed capacity? The candidates are obvious. A Taiwan crisis where China moves to unify the island by force. The U.S. has implied commitments to Taiwan's defense, but no formal treaty. American forces would face Chinese military power in China's near abroad, requiring sustained deployment across the Pacific against an adversary with regional advantage. A major NATO crisis where Russia escalates in Eastern Europe and the U.S. must honor Article 5 commitments, while simultaneously managing Pacific commitments and Middle East presence. A Middle East escalation involving Iran that requires sustained military operations while maintaining deterrence in Europe and Asia. Or a major economic crisis that forces painful choices between domestic needs and international commitments. The specific trigger doesn't matter. What matters is the mechanism. Britain's mistake wasn't Suez specifically. Britain's mistake was maintaining commitments it could no longer afford until one crisis exposed the gap. The revelation created cascading credibility collapse. Allies questioned reliability. Adversaries tested resolve. Markets questioned stability. Once the pattern became visible, it became irreversible. America is making the exact same mistake. The commitment structure assumes unlimited capacity. The economic foundation is eroding. The gap between appearance and reality grows wider. At some point, a crisis will test whether America can actually deliver on its promises. If it can't, or if it can only do so at devastating economic cost, the revelation will cascade exactly as it did for Britain. The question isn't whether the pattern will play out. The pattern always plays out. The question is when. Here's what's worse. America's position is actually more fragile than Britain's in 1947 in one critical way. Britain had an empire to dismantle. Britain could withdraw from colonies, reduce commitments, and retreat to a smaller but sustainable footprint. America's commitments aren't colonies. They're alliance networks. Withdrawing from NATO doesn't just end an obligation. It potentially collapses the entire security architecture of Europe. Pulling back from the Pacific doesn't just reduce costs. it potentially cedes the region to Chinese dominance and abandons Japan, South Korea, and other allies to accommodation with Beijing. Reducing Middle East presence doesn't just save money, it potentially allows hostile powers to control energy choke points that affect global trade. America built a system where its commitments are interconnected. Reducing one undermines the others. This makes the trap even tighter than Britain faced. The escalation continues. U.S. political leaders across both parties still speak in the language of global dominance. Presidential candidates promise to confront China while supporting Ukraine, while maintaining Middle East commitments while strengthening NATO. The rhetoric assumes unlimited capacity, but the mathematics say otherwise. The Congressional Budget Office projects that debt held by the public will reach 166% of GDP by 2054 under current policies. That's before any major crisis or war requiring emergency spending. The trajectory is clear, and yet the commitments keep expanding. America is walking the exact same path Britain walked from 1945 to 1956. Building commitments the economic base can't sustain, postponing hard choices. Assuming credibility can substitute for capacity, operating on prestige rather than power. The pattern says this ends one way, with a crisis that exposes the gap, with a moment when commitments are tested and capacity proves insufficient, with a rapid unraveling of global position once the illusion breaks. Britain went from Yalta to begging for common market admission in 17 years. The American version could move even faster in our interconnected world, where financial markets operate in milliseconds and credibility collapses can cascade globally in hours. We're not living in a world shaped by American strength. We're living in a world shaped by American overextension that hasn't yet been tested to failure. The pattern is operating. The warning signs are visible. The only question is whether 2026 or 2027, or whenever the test comes, will be the moment when America learns the same lesson Britain learned on November 6, 1956. That you can't afford to be a superpower just because you used to be one. And the pattern never lies.